The year was 1984, a time when the world was shifting, yet in the deep, emerald shadows of the Pacific Northwest, time seemed to have congealed like cold grease on a rusted coupling. Oregon, a land of ancient towering sentinels, pines and firs that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, now standing as silent, indifferent witnesses to the arrival of a mechanical era that cared little for the sanctity of the wild. Here, the air did not just carry moisture, it carried the weight of 1,000 storms, a thick, suffocating mist that clung to the skin like a damp shroud. It was an atmosphere thick with the scent of wet earth, rotting needles, and the sharp, intrusive tang of industrial progress. The forest was not merely a backdrop, it was a living, breathing entity, exhaling a cold breath that chilled the bones of any man daring to tread within its lightless corridors. In the heart of this wilderness lay the rail depot, a sprawling necropolis of iron and steel. Under the oppressive, bruised sky of a late October night, the depot felt less like a hub of commerce and more like a cathedral dedicated to the gods of industry and isolation. The ground, a mosaic of oil-slicked gravel and rain-drenched timber, reflected the sickly yellow glow of flickering sodium lamps. These lights did not illuminate, they merely cast long, grotesque shadows that danced in the swirling fog, making the massive locomotives look like slumbering prehistoric beasts, their iron hides cold and unyielding. Every bolt, every rivet of these machines was a testament to human ambition, yet in the midnight gloom they appeared alien, menacing, and utterly devoid of mercy. Listen closely. Beyond the rhythmic patter of the relentless Oregon rain against the corrugated metal roofs, there was a sound that defined this place, a low, guttural vibration that seemed to emanate from the very bowels of the earth. It was the idling of a 1,000-horsepower diesel engine, a slow, mechanical heartbeat that pulsed through the soles of your boots. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of power, but also the sound of inevitability. Wisps of white steam escaped from hidden valves, hissing into the frigid night air, before being swallowed by the darkness. This was a realm where human life felt small, transient, and utterly fragile against the backdrop of such colossal, indifferent machinery. The vibrations traveled through the steel tracks, humming a low, mournful dirge for those who spent their lives subservient to the rhythm of the rail. The depot was a place of ghosts even before the tragedy struck. You could feel them in the hollow clang of a distant wrench hitting a steel floor, in the lonely whistle of wind through the gantry cranes, and in the weary eyes of the men who moved through the fog like phantoms. These were men of soot and shadow, their faces etched with the lines of 100 sleepless nights, and the quiet desperation of those who have tied their souls to the iron road. They spoke in low tones, their words stolen by the wind, knowing that out here, in the vast silence of the Cascades, nature was always waiting to reclaim what was stolen. Their movements were heavy, burdened by the generational weight of labor that offered no promise of escape, only the certainty of more toil under the watchful eye of the pines. On this particular night, the fog felt heavier, the air colder, as if the forest itself was drawing a deep, warning breath. The tracks stretched out into the blackness like silver veins, leading towards a horizon that offered no comfort, only the promise of more labor and the growing chill of a winter that felt as though it would never end. There was a profound, unsettling stillness in the intervals between the engine's roars, a silence that felt heavy with the weight of what was to come. The stage was set, not with fanfare, but with the cold, methodical precision of fate. This was the beginning of the end, a moment frozen in the amber of memory, where the scent of pine and the smell of diesel merged into a singular, haunting perfume of impending doom. As the clock on the station wall ticked with a mechanical indifference, its hands moving with a jagged, mocking rhythm, the first gears of a catastrophic chain of events began to grind. It wasn't a sudden explosion or a dramatic scream. It was the quiet, insidious creeping of resentment, as cold and persistent as the Oregon mist,
slowly poisoning the heart of a man who had given everything to the rails, only to find that the rails offered nothing back but a hollow, echoing silence. The iron was ready. The forest was waiting. The very atmosphere seemed to thicken with a dark intent, as if the geography of the place itself had conspired to facilitate a disaster. The ghosts were already beginning to gather at the edge of the light, their translucent forms blending with the steam and the fog, waiting for the moment when the steel would finally scream. The dampness of the night seemed to seep into the metal itself, creating a slick, treacherous surface on every handrail and ladder. The depot's lights hummed with a low-frequency buzz that grated on the nerves, a constant reminder of the artificiality of this intrusion into the wilderness. To an outsider, it was a scene of industrial efficiency. To those who lived it, it was a cage of steam and iron. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out, a sharp, discordant sound that cut through the mechanical drone, a harbinger of the chaos that was currently manifesting in the mind of one man. The tragedy was not born of fire, but of this cold, stagnant dampness, the perfect breeding ground for a hatred that had been nurtured in the dark.
Elijah was not merely a man who worked the rails. He was a fragment of the machine itself, a jagged piece of iron that had been ground down by decades of friction until only the sharpest edges remained. To look at him was to look at the history of the Oregon line, a history written in sweat, grease, and a silence that bordered on the pathological. He was a third-generation railroader, a man whose very DNA seemed infused with the carbon of coal dust and the sulfur of diesel exhaust. His grandfather had laid the timber ties that now rotted beneath the modern steel, and his father had died in a coupling accident during the Great Freeze of '62. Elijah carried their failures and their exhaustion like a heavy cloak, one that he refused to shed even in the heat of a summer noon. His face was a cartography of resentment. Deep, cavernous furrows ran across his brow like the very tracks he serviced, and his skin had the texture of cured leather that had been left out in the acid rain for too long. But it was his eyes that truly unsettled those who dared to hold his gaze. They were a piercing glacial blue, not the blue of a clear sky, but the cold, dead blue of deep ice at the bottom of a crevasse. There was no light in them, only a flickering shadow of a fire that had long since burned out, leaving behind nothing but bitter ash. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, every step a calculated expenditure of energy, as if he were conserving his strength for a final, terrible act of defiance against a world that had forgotten his worth. In the 1980s, the railway was changing. The old ways, the intuitive understanding of a machine's hum, the respect for seniority, the unspoken bond of the Iron Brotherhood, were being eroded by a new breed of efficiency experts and college-educated managers who looked at men like Elijah as obsolete parts. To the corporation, he was an entry in a ledger, a depreciating asset. But to Elijah, the railway was his cathedral, his battlefield, and his prison. He knew every curve of the track from Portland to the coast, every groan of the trestle bridges, every temperamental quirk of the aging General Motors locomotives. He felt the vibrations of the rails in his marrow long before the train appeared on the horizon. He was the guardian of a dying era, and the bitterness of his impending obsolescence had curdled into a dark, visceral envy. His hands were his most telling feature. Garneled and thick, with knuckles like rusted bolts, they were permanently stained with the indelible black ink of machinery. No amount of lye or scrubbing could remove the grease that had worked its way into the very pores of his skin. These were hands that had wrestled with frozen switches in sub-zero blizzards, hands that had bled for the company, hands that had never known the softness of luxury. They were now the instruments of his silent war. When he gripped a wrench, it wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon. Every turn of a bolt was a small, private vengeance against the ghosts of his father and grandfather, and against the young men who now walked the depots with clean fingernails and bright futures. Elijah lived in a small, clapboard house that sat too close to the tracks, where the windows rattled every time a freight train thundered past. He didn't mind the noise, he needed it. The silence of a world without the railway was something he couldn't comprehend. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and damp wool.
He had no wife, no children, only the company of his own darkening thoughts and the rhythmic ticking of a heavy brass watch that had belonged to the man who died in 62. He was a man who had been hollowed out by the very industry he served, leaving a void that was now being filled by a singular, poisonous obsession. He stood now in the shadow of the engine house, a silhouette among silhouettes. The younger workers avoided him, sensing the cold radiation of his disdain. They called him the iron ghost behind his back, but to his face they said nothing. Elijah preferred it that way. He didn't want their pity or their shallow camaraderie. He wanted what was his. He wanted the recognition that his bloodline had earned over a century of labor. He wanted the promotion that had been whispered about in the break rooms, the supervisor position that would finally justify the sacrifices of 3 generations. But as he watched the mist swirl around his heavy boots, he already knew the truth. The world was moving on, and it was leaving him behind in the dark. This realization didn't break him. It forged him. It turned his heart into a pressurized vessel of spite, waiting for the smallest crack to erupt. He wasn't looking for a way out. He was looking for a way to make the world feel the same cold, grinding weight that he felt every morning. He was the architect of his own ruin, and soon he would become the architect of a tragedy that would scream across the headlines, a final, bloody signature on a career built on silence and shadow. As the rain began to fall in earnest, Elijah adjusted his cap, his icy eyes fixed on the distant, glowing red lights of the signal tower, and he smiled, a thin, joyless movement of the lips that held all the warmth of a tombstone. The resentment was no longer a feeling. It was a physical presence, a thick, oily film that coated his lungs. He felt it with every breath he took in the damp Oregon night. It was a silent companion that walked with him across the gravel of the depot, whispering of the injustices he had suffered and the respect he was owed. He was the king of a graveyard of iron, and he was ready to bring the temple down around his ears. The tracks were waiting, the engines were idling, and the iron ghost was finally ready to take his seat at the head of the table, even if that table was at the bottom of a ravine.
Inside the cab of locomotive number 402, the world of shadows and freezing mist felt 1,000 miles away, though only a thin pane of reinforced glass separated the men from the abyss. This was the inner sanctum, a cramped cockpit of brass dials, heavy lever handles, and the rhythmic, comforting thrum of a diesel heart. The air here was a thick, domestic soup of human presence. The steam from overbrewed Maxwell House coffee, the faint, sweet scent of cherry pipe tobacco, and the honest, pungent smell of damp wool drying against a radiator. For Thomas, the young engineer, and his veteran crew, this small space was more than a workstation. It was a sanctuary where the terrors of the Oregon wilderness were held at bay by the warmth of shared stories and the fragile bonds of friendship. Thomas sat in the captain's chair. His hands, unlike Elijah's, still possessed a youthful suppleness, though they were beginning to develop the calluses of the trade. He was a man of the new era, possessing a bright, easy smile that seemed to offend the very walls of the depot. Beside him sat old Pete, a man who had spent 40 years on the line and had a laugh that sounded like gravel being turned in a mixer. They were joined by Miller, the brakeman, a young father who had spent the last hour showing off a crumpled Polaroid of his newborn daughter. In this moment, they weren't just employees of a faceless corporation. They were the living, breathing soul of the railway, a brotherhood forged in the shared silence of long-haul nights and the mutual trust that kept their heavy charge on the rails. The conversation was mundane, almost beautiful in its simplicity. They talked about the upcoming fishing season on the Deschutes River, the price of lumber, and the small domestic dramas of their lives back in the valley. There was a lightness in the air, a sense of almost there, as they prepared for what they assumed would be just another routine run through the mountains. Pete was mid-story, gesturing with a half-eaten sandwich about a legendary derailment back in '74 that ended with a locomotive in a farmer's pond. His eyes crinkled with genuine mirth, a stark contrast to the hollow, icy stares that haunted the engine house outside. They were laughing, a warm, resonant sound that filled the cab, momentarily drowning out the ominous hiss of the air brakes. This was the tragedy's most cruel irony, the sheer normalcy of those last minutes. These men were not heroes or villains. They were fathers, sons, and friends who believed in the reliability of the steel beneath them. They trusted the switches, they trusted the signals, and most tragically, they trusted their fellow man. They didn't know that every mile they covered was bringing them closer to a point of no return, orchestrated by a man who had sat in this very seat and felt only the cold sting of envy. To Thomas, the promotion he had just received was a milestone of a career beginning. He couldn't have known it was actually a death warrant, signed in the dark by a colleague he had once admired. As Miller reached over to adjust the heater, the soft orange glow of the instrument panel illuminated their faces, casting them in a light that felt almost holy in its intimacy. Outside, the wind howled through the trestles, a mournful, predatory sound. But inside, they were safe, or so they thought. They shared a communal thermos, passing it around like a chalice, a ritual of the road that had been performed 10,000 times before. The coffee was bitter and burnt, but it tasted like life. They were a team, a synchronized unit, where every man knew his role, every man watched the other's back. This was the pinnacle of the Iron Brotherhood, a peak of human connection that was about to be shattered by the most primal of human flaws. The clock on the console clicked, 2:14 a.m. The departure signal would come any second. Thomas checked his gauges one last time, the needles dancing with a steady, reassuring precision. He felt a surge of pride. He was at the helm of 1,000,000 pounds of machinery, responsible for the safe passage of his friends and his cargo. He looked at Pete and Miller, nodding with a quiet confidence that only the young can truly possess. They were ready. They were invincible. They were the masters of the night. None of them saw the shadow that flickered past the station window, a silent, resentful ghost, watching their laughter with a hatred that could freeze boiling water. As the highball signal finally echoed through their headsets, Thomas eased the throttle forward. The massive engine let out a deep, resonant growl, a vibration that shook them to their very teeth. "Here we go, boys," Pete muttered, settling into his seat with a satisfied grunt. The train began to crawl forward, a slow, majestic departure from the pool of light into the waiting maw of the forest. The laughter began to die down as the professional focus took over, but the warmth remained, a lingering ghost of happiness that would soon be extinguished. They were moving into the dark, carrying their jokes and their dreams into a trap that had been laid with the cold, mechanical precision of a madman's heart.
To understand the tragedy of the number 402, one must first understand the sensory landscape of the Oregon Line, a world where the air was not merely oxygen, but a dense, suffocating cocktail of industrial progress and ancient decay. As the train prepared to leave the depot, the atmosphere was a thick, textured presence that settled on the skin like a film of cold sweat. It was the smell of the railway, a sharp, acrid bite of burning diesel fuel that stung the nostrils, mixed with the metallic, coppery tang of grinding brake pads and the heavy, sweet scent of creosote-soaked timber ties. It was a perfume of labor, a scent that lingered in the hair and clothes of the men long after their shifts had ended, a permanent reminder of their subservience to the Iron Road. Beyond the smell, there was the sound, a constant, unrelenting symphony of mechanical stress. It wasn't just the roar of the engine, it was the symphony of 1,000,000 moving parts screaming in unison. It was the rhythmic, metallic clack-clack of the wheels crossing the rail gaps, a sound that felt like it was tapping directly into the base of your skull. It was the high-pitched, ghostly moan of the wind as it whipped through the skeletal framework of the trestle bridges, a sound that the old-timers called the mountain's whistle. And underneath it all, the low-frequency thrum of the 16-cylinder prime mover, a vibration so deep it didn't just rattle the windows, it vibrated the very fluid in your inner ear, a constant subsonic reminder of the massive forces being harnessed and held in check by nothing more than thin layers of steel. And then there was the cold. This wasn't the sharp, dry cold of the high desert. This was the damp, invasive chill of the Pacific Northwest, a cold that possessed a malicious intelligence. It crawled through the smallest cracks in the locomotive's cab, seeking out the gaps in a man's heavy wool coat, settling into the joints and turning fingers into stiff, unresponsive talons. It carried with it the scent of the deep forest, the smell of rotting hemlock needles, crushed ferns, and the ancient, stagnant water of the mountain box. This cold didn't just lower your temperature, it sapped your resolve, making every movement a deliberate struggle against a world that wanted you to slow down, to freeze, to become as still as the trees that line the tracks. Inside the depot's break room, where Elijah had spent so many bitter hours, these sensations were amplified. The room smelled of wet ashtrays, burnt percolator coffee, and the faint ozone-heavy scent of an old electrical heater that rattled on its mount. Every surface was coated in a fine, invisible grit, a mixture of coal dust and fine mountain silt that turned every touch into a grinding sensation. To the men who lived here,
This was the texture of reality. There was no softness in this world, no silk or velvet. There was only the abrasive honesty of wood, iron, and stone. Even the light was hard, provided by humming fluorescent tubes that flickered with a rhythmic, headache-inducing pulse, casting a sickly, desaturated pallor over everything they touched. The wind outside didn't just blow, it hunted. It tore at the heavy canvas curtains of the maintenance sheds and whistled through the empty freight cars like a mournful flute. It carried the sound of the distant river, the roar of white water over jagged basalt, reminding the railroaders that they were merely guests in a landscape that had no regard for their schedules or their safety. This was a place where the elements and the industry were in a state of perpetual grinding warfare. The smell of grease was the smell of the defense. The sound of the engine was the sound of the advance. And on this night, the balance was about to tip, as the cold, wet air of Oregon prepared to swallow the heat and light of the number 402. Every detail, from the rusted tin mug on the stained table to the way the engine's vibration made the coffee in that mug dance in concentric circles, was a part of the tapestry of the tragedy. You could feel the history of the line in the very grain of the wooden benches, worn smooth by the backs of 1,000 tired men. You could hear the ghosts of past failures in every creak of the floorboards. It was an environment designed to harden a man's heart, to turn his thoughts as gray and unyielding as the sky above. And for a man like Elijah, this sensory overload was the fuel for his fire, a constant reminder of the grit and the grime that had defined his life and the life of his father before him. As the number 402 finally cleared the yard, the sensory world shifted. The depot's artificial hum faded, replaced by the absolute crushing silence of the old-growth forest, punctuated only by the train's own mechanical heartbeat. The smell of diesel became a lonely trail in the vast pine-scented dark. The men inside the cab leaned into the warmth, unaware that the sensory world they occupied, the smell of coffee, the sound of laughter, the vibration of the seat, was about to be replaced by the terrifying, visceral reality of screaming metal and the sudden, absolute cold of the Oregon night.
The climax of Elijah's silent rage did not arrive with a thunderclap, but with the quiet pinning of a single sheet of paper onto a cork bulletin board. It happened in the supervisor's office, a room that smelled of old cigars and stagnant bureaucracy. The air was thick with the dust of 1,000 filed reports, illuminated by a solitary, flickering desk lamp that cast long, jittery shadows across the wood-paned walls. It was here, amidst the humming of a prehistoric radiator and the distant clanging of the yard, that the fate of the Oregon line was sealed. The announcement was brief, typed on a manual Remington with a fading ribbon, but to Elijah, every letter was a jagged glass shard pressed into his soul. Thomas Miller, appointed to night shift supervisor, effective immediately. The name Thomas rang in Elijah's ears like a funeral bell. Thomas, a man who had barely seen a decade on the rails, a man whose hands still held the softness of youth, a man who spoke of optimization and efficiency instead of tradition and grit. Elijah stood in the back of the small crowd of workers, his shadow stretching long and thin across the grimy floorboards. While the other men offered half-hearted claps and slaps on the back, Elijah felt a cold, familiar vacuum opening up in his chest. It was the sound of a century of family loyalty being crumpled and tossed into a wastepaper basket. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply stared at the paper until the words began to blur into a singular black stain. In that moment, the hierarchy of the railway, the only world Elijah had ever known, had betrayed its own fundamental laws. Seniority was the religion of the rail, a sacred covenant that promised a man a seat at the table if he survived the cold and the grease for long enough. By choosing Thomas, the company hadn't just bypassed Elijah. They had declared his entire existence and the existence of his father and grandfather to be a historical footnote. The Iron Ghost looked around at the younger faces in the room, seeing their hidden smirks and their pitying glances. He felt the weight of his 3 generations of service pressing down on him, not as a badge of honor, but as a tombstone. The conflict was no longer about a job title or a slight increase in pay. It was about the desecration of a legacy. Thomas was the embodiment of the new world, a world that didn't value the way a man could hear a hairline fracture in a rail by the sound of the wheels, or how he could predict a blizzard by the smell of the wind. To the company, Thomas was the future. To Elijah, Thomas was a thief who had stolen the only thing Elijah had left, his pride. The resentment that had been a slow-simmering stew for years suddenly reached its boiling point, turning into a pressurized, volatile vapor that demanded an outlet. Elijah watched as Thomas accepted the congratulations, his young face lit with a genuine, nauseating brightness. Thomas looked over at Elijah, offering a nod of respect,
a gesture that felt to Elijah like a spit in the face. It was the condescension of the victor, the hollow pity of the man who has taken everything and thinks a nod can pay the debt. Elijah's fingers twitched at his side, his gnarled knuckles turning white as he gripped his cap. He didn't see a colleague, he saw a parasite. He didn't see a supervisor, he saw a target. The office, once a place of authority, now felt like a cage where his dignity was being publicly dissected. As the men filtered out of the office to return to their shifts, Elijah remained for a heartbeat longer. The room was silent now, save for the rhythmic clack-clack of a nearby telegraph and the low hum of the forest wind against the glass. He reached out, his grease-stained finger hovering just inches from Thomas's name on the list. In his mind, a map of the Cascades unfolded, the steep grades, the sharp turns, the deep, lightless ravines where the earth opened up to swallow the steel. He realized then that if the company wanted efficiency, he would give them a listen in consequence. If they wanted the new world, he would show them how easily it could be broken by the old. He turned and walked out into the rain, his movements now fueled by a dark, terrifying purpose. The transition was complete. The worker had died, and the saboteur had been born. Every drop of rain that hit his face felt like a baptism into a new faith, a faith of destruction. He didn't need their promotion. He didn't need their respect. He would have something much more permanent. He would have their memory. He would engrave his name into the history of the Oregon line in a way that no ledger could ever erase. The conflict had moved beyond words, beyond HR reports, and into the cold, unyielding realm of physics and spite.
The air outside the supervisor's office was a cold, liquid weight. It didn't just rain in the Oregon Cascades. The sky seemed to collapse, dissolving into a gray, relentless deluge that blurred the line between the earth and the atmosphere. It was here, in the shadow of a rusted, corrugated metal maintenance shed, that Elijah finally cornered Thomas. The blue light of a distant, idling locomotive cut through the downpour, catching the falling droplets like thousands of falling diamonds. But there was nothing precious about this moment. The atmosphere was charged with a static tension, a psychic pressure that made the hair on the back of the neck stand up. The only sounds were the rhythmic drumming of rain on tin and the heavy, wet boots of two men standing on the precipice of a feud. "You think you earned this, boy?" Elijah's voice didn't rise above the rain. It cut through it, a low, rasping sound like a shovel dragging over gravel. He stood perfectly still, his heavy raincoat slick and glistening, making him look like a dark, statuesque predator. Thomas had turned, surprised, his face still holding a trace of the easy confidence that had been his undoing in Elijah's eyes. The young man tried to offer a conciliatory smile, the smile of someone who believes the world is inherently fair, but it withered under the sheer, radioactive heat of Elijah's stare. There were no witnesses here, only the towering pines and the indifferent machinery of the yard. The argument wasn't about schedules or freight manifests. It was a collision of two irreconcilable eras. Thomas spoke of modern safety protocols and streamlined operations, his voice tight with the frustration of a man trying to explain color to someone who had lived in black and white. But to Elijah, every word Thomas uttered was a desecration. Every mention of new standards was an insult to the men who had bled into the ballast to keep the tracks straight. "My father died for this line," Elijah growled, stepping closer until the smell of his damp wool and stale tobacco crowded Thomas's space. "My grandfather went blind in the tunnel so you could sit in a warm office and play with your paper lists. You aren't a railroader. You're a clerk in a hat." Thomas's patience finally snapped. The rain lashed at his face as he shouted back, his voice cracking with the strain of suppressed anger. He spoke the truth that Elijah had been running from for years, that the world didn't owe him a debt for his ancestors' suffering. He told Elijah that his bitterness was a rot, a cancer that was making him dangerous to the crew. It was a moment of brutal honesty, the kind that can either save a man or destroy him. For Elijah, it was the final nail. Hearing his life's work dismissed as a rot by a man who had barely seen a winter on the mountain was the spark that hit the pressurized vapor of his envy. The blue light of the locomotive flared as it moved onto a siding, momentarily illuminating Elijah's face. For a split second, Thomas saw it. Not anger, but a profound, terrifying void. It was the look of a man who had already decided that nothing mattered anymore. The conflict had transcended a professional dispute. It had become an existential war. Elijah didn't throw a punch. He didn't need to. He simply leaned in, his icy eyes inches from Thomas's, and whispered something that was swallowed by a sudden crash of thunder. He turned and walked away into the dark, his silhouette disappearing into the wall of rain, before Thomas could even find his breath. Thomas stood there for a long time, the cold water soaking through his jacket.
He felt a sudden, inexplicable shiver, not from the temperature, but from the realization that he had just looked into the eyes of a man who was no longer bound by the laws of society or the instinct of self-preservation. The maintenance shed, the gravel, the blue-lit mist, it all felt suddenly hostile, as if the environment itself had taken Elijah's side. He tried to shake the feeling, to tell himself it was just the nerves of a new promotion, but the weight of that encounter hung over him like a shroud. As Thomas finally headed toward the warmth of the dispatch office, he didn't see Elijah watching from the shadows of a water tower. Elijah wasn't angry anymore. He was calm. The decision had been made, the sentence had been passed, and the execution was already in motion. The rain continued to wash over the depot, cleaning the grease from the tracks, but it could never wash away the stain of the words spoken in the dark. The feud had been ignited, and it wouldn't be quenched until the fire of the crash lit up the Oregon sky.
The location was Milepost 114, a desolate stretch of track where the Oregon wilderness seemed to collapse in on itself, squeezing the steel rails between a vertical rock face and a precipitous drop into the black maw of the gorge below. Here, the wind didn't just blow, it shrieked through the jagged basalt columns, a sound like 1,000 mourners. Elijah moved through the shadows with the practiced ease of a mountain predator. He didn't need a flashlight. He knew the placement of every tie, every bolt, every rusted spike by touch. In the heavy, saturated darkness of 3 a.m., he was a ghost returning to a haunt he had built himself. The rain had turned into a fine, freezing mist that coated the metal in a treacherous, icy glaze. Elijah knelt by the heavy iron housing of the manual switch, a mechanism he had maintained for over 15 years. He felt a twisted sense of intimacy with the cold steel. This was his instrument. He reached into the deep pocket of his oilskin coat and pulled out a heavy, industrial-grade pipe wrench, its teeth worn but still hungry for grip. There was no hesitation in his movements, no tremor in his hands. He wasn't a man committing a crime. In his own fractured mind, he was an architect restoring balance to a world that had tilted too far in favor of the undeserving. With a grunt of effort that was lost to the howling wind, he applied the wrench to the locking mechanism. The metal groaned, a sharp, piercing protest that echoed off the canyon walls, but Elijah ignored it. He worked with a terrifying, clinical precision. He wasn't just breaking the switch, he was recalibrating it to lie. He adjusted the tension rod so that the signal lights back at the dispatch office would show a clear green, while the physical rails themselves would remain in a deadly halfway position, a split switch. It was a masterpiece of lethal engineering, a trap that would catch the massive wheels of the number 402 and trip them into the abyss. As he worked, the smell of the forest seemed to intensify, the scent of wet hemlock and ancient rotting earth. It was as if the wilderness was leaning in, curious to see what this small, bitter man was doing to the steel parasite that had cut through its heart. Elijah's breath came in short, ragged plumes of white vapor. His fingers were numb, the skin on his knuckles cracked and bleeding from the cold. But he felt a strange, ecstatic warmth spreading through his chest. For the first time in decades, he felt powerful. He wasn't a forgotten relic. He was the master of life and death, the one who held the strings of the great iron marionette. He stood up, his task complete. He looked down at the switch, now a silent, waiting predator disguised as a mundane piece of equipment. In his mind's eye, he could already see the headlight of Thomas's locomotive rounding the bend, the crew laughing inside the warm cab, oblivious to the fact that the very ground beneath them had been betrayed. He felt no flicker of remorse. The faces of Pete, Miller, and Thomas were merely abstractions to him now, sacrifices on the altar of his legacy. The irony was perfect. The very skill and knowledge the company had deemed obsolete was the very thing that would now bring their world screaming to a halt. He wiped the grease from his wrench onto his coat and stepped back into the tree line. The fog swallowed him almost instantly, leaving only the tracks and the silence of the impending disaster. The switch lay there, a silver trap under the pale, watery moonlight that briefly broke through the clouds. It looked innocent, a silent servant of the line, but it carried the weight of Elijah's hatred. The physics of the tragedy were now set in stone. The kinetic energy of 70 cars and 3 locomotives were already being funneled towards this single broken point in the dark. Elijah didn't look back. He began the long trek back towards the depot, his boots crunching rhythmically on the ballast. He was at peace. He had spoken his final word to the Oregon line,
and it was a word that would echo through the valley for generations. The silence of Milepost 114 was no longer peaceful. It was pregnant with the scream of tearing metal. The trap was set, the hunter was retreating to the shadows, and the Iron Ghost was finally ready to watch the world burn in the name of a stolen promotion.
Elijah stood on a desolate, rain-slicked ridge overlooking the yard, a shadow among the towering skeletons of the Oregon pines. From this height, the depot looked like a flickering, wounded animal, its lights struggling against the encroaching tide of the mountain mist. He watched, his breathing slow and rhythmic, as locomotive number 402 began its slow, majestic crawl toward the north. The sound reached him seconds after the movement, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very rock beneath his boots. It was the sound of a funeral procession, though only he heard the dirge. The train looked like a glowing serpent, its long spine of freight cars snaking through the switches he knew so well, heading toward the darkness of the high Cascades. The red tail lights of the caboose flickered like dying embers in the fog, smaller and smaller, until they were just pinpricks of blood-red light against the velvet blackness of the forest. Elijah felt a strange, cold peace wash over him, a sensation of finality that was almost religious. He wasn't just watching a train, he was watching the physical manifestation of his own resentment being carried away into the night. Every revolution of those massive steel wheels was bringing Thomas and his crew closer to the trap at Milepost 114. The distance was narrowing, the time was evaporating, and the laws of physics were now the only judges left in the world. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the sharp ozone tang of an approaching storm. Elijah didn't shiver. He felt insulated by the sheer magnitude of his act. He thought of the men inside the cab, Thomas with his bright future, Pete with his gravelly laugh, Miller with the photo of his child. In his mind, they were already ghosts, their lives already extinguished by the simple turn of a wrench. He didn't hate them as individuals anymore. They were merely components of a system that had failed him, and as such they had to be cleared from the ledger. He was the auditor of their fate, and his audit was absolute. There was a profound loneliness in that moment, a realization that he had finally cut the last cord that bound him to the world of the living. By sabotaging the line, he had sabotaged his own soul, but to Elijah it was a fair trade. He would rather be a king in a realm of wreckage than a servant in a world that didn't know his name. He watched until the last faint glow of the locomotive's headlight disappeared behind a jagged basalt cliff. The silence that followed was heavy, almost physical, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind through the hemlock needles. The train was gone. The die was cast. The irony of this scene was not lost on him. He had spent his life ensuring the safety of these tracks, making sure the steel was true and the switches were sure. Now his legacy was the exact opposite. He had become the flaw in the machine, the ghost in the gears. As he turned away from the ridge to begin his descent, he felt a momentary flick of something, not regret, but a phantom memory of the man he used to be, the man who had been proud to wear the railway's emblem. But that man had died in the rain outside the supervisor's office, and only the Iron Ghost remained. He walked through the dark forest, his boots sinking into the soft, rotting carpet of pine needles. The trees seemed to lean away from him, their branches whispering warnings he no longer cared to hear. He had set a fire in the dark, and now all he had to do was wait for the smoke to rise. The Cascades were vast and indifferent, a landscape that had seen 1,000 tragedies and would see 1,000 more. But this one belonged entirely to him. It was his masterpiece, written in grease and spite, and the final period was about to be placed at the bottom of a ravine. The night was now absolute. The depot lights were gone, the train was gone, and Elijah was alone with the sound of his own heart. He didn't need to see the crash to know it was happening. He could feel the tension in the earth, the silent scream of the rails as they carried the weight of the condemned toward Milepost 114. He reached into his pocket and touched the cold, heavy wrench one last time, a silent anchor in a world that was about to drift into chaos. The Iron Ghost was satisfied. The journey had begun, and there were no more signals to stop it. The number 402 climbed deeper into the throat of the Cascades, its 3 massive diesel units roaring in a synchronized, thunderous effort to conquer the steepening grade. The sound was a primal scream of industrial defiance against the laws of gravity. Inside the cab, the air was still warm, but the atmosphere had shifted from the jovial banter of the depot to a focused, professional silence. Thomas sat at the controls, his eyes fixed on the narrow cone of light that pierced the swirling wall of Oregon mist. To him, the headlight was a shield. He couldn't see that it was merely illuminating the path to his own execution. The fog here was so thick, it seemed to have a physical weight, pressing against the windshield, turning the towering hemlocks into ghostly, reaching hands that vanished as quickly as they appeared. They were approaching the big trestle, a skeletal masterpiece of timber and steel that spanned a 300-foot drop into the black, churning waters of the Rogue River tributary. The bridge groaned under the immense weight of the 70 freight cars, a rhythmic, haunting sound that vibrated through the floor of the cab. Thomas adjusted the throttle with a steady hand, feeling the surge of power beneath him. He was confident. He believed in the machine. He believed in the track, and he believed in the signals that continued to glow a reassuring, steady green on his dashboard. A digital lie manufactured by Elijah's hand at Milepost 114. Behind him, Pete was checking his pocket watch, the brass casing glinting in the soft amber light of the gauges. "Running 3 minutes fast, kid," he shouted over the engine's roar, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who had made this run 10,000 times. Miller was leaning against the back wall, staring out the side window at the darkness, perhaps thinking of the warm bed and the quiet house waiting for him at the end of the line. They were 1,000,000 pounds of momentum, a juggernaut of steel and commerce, and they felt invincible. The bridge beneath them hummed a low, vibrating note, a warning that none of them were trained to hear. As the locomotive cleared the trestle, it entered a sharp, blind curve, known to the railroaders as the Devil's Elbow. It was a place where the mountain had been blasted away to make room for a narrow ledge of ballast and rail. On one side, a vertical wall of basalt. On the other, a plummet into nothingness. The centrifugal force began to lean the heavy engine toward the outside of the curve, a familiar sensation that Thomas countered with a practiced ease. But tonight, the air felt different. The smell of the forest was sharper, the scent of wet pine needles and ozone overpowering even the diesel fumes. It was as if the earth itself was tensing, bracing for an impact it knew was coming. Thomas peered through the rain-streaked glass, searching for the switch lanterns of Milepost 114. There they were, 2 points of emerald light blinking through the fog, promising safe passage. He had no reason to doubt them. He didn't see the slight, unnatural tilt of the rail ahead, the way the steel had been forced into a position that defied the geometry of safety. He didn't see the dark, wet gap where the wheels were supposed to find purchase, but would instead find only empty air and the crushing weight of their own momentum. To Thomas, the green light was a promise. To the physics of the mountain, it was a joke. The locomotive hit the beginning of the switch at 60 miles per hour. For a fraction of a second, there was a strange, sickening lurch, a feeling of weightlessness that made Thomas's stomach drop. It was the sensation of 1,000 tons of steel losing its grip on the earth. The rhythm of the wheels changed from a steady clack-clack to a chaotic, screaming grind of metal on stone. Thomas's hand flew to the emergency brake, his instincts screaming that the world had just shifted on its axis, but it was already too late. The kinetic energy they had spent the last 2 hours building was now an unstoppable force of destruction. The lights in the cab flickered and died as the primary electrical lines were severed. In that final second of darkness, the only sound was the roar of the wind and the high-pitched, agonizing scream of the rails being torn from their beds. Thomas looked over at Pete, but he could only see a silhouette of a man who realized, too late, that the Brotherhood had been betrayed. The number 402 wasn't a train anymore. It was a projectile. It cleared the ledge, its headlight casting a final, desperate beam into the treetops of the ravine below, before the gravity of Oregon finally claimed its prize.
Violence in the Oregon wilderness is usually a quiet affair, a hawk's strike, the slow rot of a fallen cedar. But tonight, at Milepost 114, the silence was shattered by a cataclysm that sounded like the earth itself was being torn asunder. When the leading wheels of the number 402 struck the sabotaged switch, the laws of physics took over with a brutal, indifferent efficiency. The split rail acted like a giant chisel, stripping the massive steel flanges from the wheels and sending 60 tons of locomotive into a violent, uncontrolled lurch. In that first microsecond, the kinetic energy, a staggering force built up over miles of mountain grade, had nowhere to go but into the destruction of the machine itself. Inside the cab, time didn't just slow down, it shattered. Thomas felt the floor vanish beneath him as the engine tilted toward the ravine. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched, agonizing screech of metal being tortured beyond its breaking point, followed by the deep, bone-shaking thud of the massive diesel engine block breaking free from its mounts. The instrument panel exploded in a shower of white-hot sparks, illuminating the faces of the crew in a strobe light nightmare. There were no screams yet. There wasn't enough air in their lungs for sound. There was only the visceral, terrifying sensation of a million-pound beast dying in midair. The locomotive didn't just fall. It plowed through the landscape like a falling star made of iron. It struck the edge of the basalt cliff, shearing off massive chunks of rock that tumbled into the dark alongside the wreckage. Trees that had stood for 2 centuries were snapped like toothpicks, their wood splintering with reports like pistol shots. The secondary and tertiary units followed, jackknifing with a sickening crunch of steel on steel. Freight cars, loaded with timber and heavy machinery, began to pile up behind them in a chaotic mountain of twisted metal, each one slamming into the next with the force of a small explosion. Then came the fire, not a clean flame, but a dirty, oily eruption as the massive fuel tanks were ruptured by the jagged remains of the tracks. A pillar of orange and crimson light punched through the Oregon fog, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched for miles into the forest. The heat was instantaneous, a wall of thermal energy that blistered the paint on the falling cars and turned the falling rain into a localized storm of scalding steam. For a few brief seconds, the dark ravine was as bright as a summer noon, revealed in all its jagged, unforgiving glory. The sound of the crash traveled down the valley, a low-frequency rumble that shook the windows of distant farmhouses and woke the birds in their nests miles away. It was a chaotic, discordant symphony, the hiss of pressurized steam escaping from ruptured lines, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of heavy containers tumbling down the slope, and the underlying constant roar of the fire. The number 402 was being disemboweled by the very terrain it had sought to conquer. The Iron Brotherhood was being scattered among the rocks and the burning debris, their laughter silenced by the cold, mechanical logic of Elijah's revenge. At the bottom of the ravine, the primary locomotive finally came to rest, inverted and crushed like a discarded toy. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise, a heavy, ringing void, punctuated only by the crackle of burning diesel and the occasional groan of cooling metal. The massive headlight, still miraculously flickering, cast a dying, jittery beam across the wreckage of a freight car, revealing the shattered remains of what had once been a symbol of industrial pride. The transition from a moving, breathing machine to a graveyard of rusted iron was complete. Above the crash site, the forest began to settle. The smoke rose in thick, black plumes, blending with the Oregon mist to create a toxic, swirling veil. The tracks above were gone, replaced by a jagged scar in the earth. Milepost 114 had claimed its prize. The envy of one man had manifested as a mountain of burning steel, a monument to the terrifying power of human malice when armed with a wrench and a lifetime of bitterness. The scream of the metal had faded, leaving only the soft, indifferent patter of the rain as it began to wash the soot from the cooling wreckage.
When the last echoes of the iron cataclysm finally bled into the damp mountain air, a silence descended upon the ravine that was heavier, more profound than any noise could ever be. It was the sound of an ending. The roaring symphony of destruction had been replaced by a chorus of small, haunting sounds. The rhythmic, metallic ping, ping, ping of cooling steel as it contracted in the freezing night, the soft, sinister hiss of escaping steam from a ruptured boiler, and the occasional wet thud of a scorched pine branch finally giving way and falling into the wreckage. The Oregon forest, once so hostile, now seemed to lean in with a terrifying, indifferent curiosity, its ancient trees standing like mourners around an open grave of twisted metal. The fire, once a roaring beast of orange and crimson, had been beaten back by the relentless, fine drizzle of the Pacific Northwest. Now it was merely a collection of smoldering embers, casting a dim, pulsating red glow that made the jagged edges of the freight cars look like the teeth of a shattered leviathan. Thick, oily smoke curled upward, weaving through the hemlock branches like a funeral shroud, carrying with it the acrid, sickening scent of burnt rubber, scorched paint, and the chemical tang of spilled industrial fluids. In this pale, flickering light, the wreckage was a landscape of surrealist horror. 1,000,000 pounds of progress turned into a mile of jagged, unrecognizable debris. Everything that had been warm and human minutes ago was gone. A crumpled Polaroid, the one Miller had been showing off, lay face down in a puddle of diesel-stained rainwater, its edges curling in the heat. A tin coffee mug, identical to the ones in the depot, sat miraculously upright on a flat rock, filled now with ash and soot instead of the bitter brew that had fueled the crew's laughter. These small domestic artifacts were the most haunting remains of the number 402, silent witnesses to the suddenness with which a life can be extinguished by the hand of spite. The Iron Brotherhood had been dissolved, not by time or distance, but by the cold, unyielding laws of kinetic energy. The river at the bottom of the gorge continued its ancient rhythmic flow, its dark waters now swirling with iridescent oil slicks that caught the moonlight like a serpent's scales. The water didn't care about the promotion Elijah hadn't received, or the dreams Thomas had held for his future. It simply washed over the broken glass and the mangled steel, an indifferent force of nature reclaiming its territory. The forest was already beginning the slow process of absorption. The mist settled into the hollows of the crushed locomotive, and the first drips of rain began to wash the soot from the cold, dead faces of the machinery. There was a strange, spectral beauty in the wreckage, a testament to the absolute power of physics. The rails above, where the train had departed the earth, hung in mid-air like broken ribs, their silver surfaces reflecting the weak, watery light of the Oregon moon. The silence was not peaceful. It was a vacuum, a hollow space where 14 lives had been subtracted from the world in a single violent heartbeat. Every shadow in the ravine seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for a scream that would never come, for a movement that was now impossible. The Iron Ghost had done his work, and the silence was his final, terrifying masterpiece. As the first pre-dawn light began to filter through the canopy, turning the fog into a pale, ghostly gray, the true scale of the disaster was revealed. It wasn't just a train wreck, it was a scar on the soul of the mountain. The wreckage looked like a line of fallen soldiers, their armor pierced and broken, left to rot in a trench they never chose to fight in. The silence remained absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that even the birds refused to break. The tragedy of Milepost 114 was no longer an event in progress. It was now a permanent part of the Oregon landscape, a story whispered by the wind through the pines and the rusting remains of the number 402. The environment had won. The industry that had sought to master these peaks had been brought low, reduced to a pile of smoldering junk at the bottom of a lightless pit. And somewhere, miles away, the man who had pulled the pin on this catastrophe was sitting in the dark, listening to this very same silence, knowing that it was a silence he could never escape. The ravine was a graveyard now, and the Oregon night was its only guardian, watching over the cooling iron and the shattered lives with the cold, unblinking eyes of the ancient wild.
The rescue effort did not begin with the high-tech precision of the modern age, but with a primal, desperate struggle against the shadows of the Oregon night. It began with the arrival of the first work trains, slow-moving iron ghosts carrying men with hollow eyes and hands that trembled from the cold. By 4:30 a.m., the ravine at Milepost 114 had become a theater of somber light and suffocating smoke. Rescuers, dressed in heavy canvas coats and yellow slickers that glistened under the freezing rain, moved through the wreckage like acolytes in a cathedral of ruins. They didn't carry sophisticated sensors. They carried heavy industrial flashlights and old-fashioned kerosene lanterns that cast a flickering amber jitter against the wall of thick, unyielding fog. The beams of their lights were weak, struggling to cut through the toxic mix of steam and diesel smoke that hung over the crash site. Each flash of light revealed a new horror: a massive steel wheel half buried in the mud like a discarded coin, the jagged, torn metal of a passenger car that looked like it had been opened by a giant's hand, and the constant, treacherous slide of shale and ballast beneath their boots. The sound of the river below was now joined by the rhythmic, heavy thud of axes and the high-pitched whine of manual saws as the men fought to reach the crushed cab of the number 402. There was very little talking. The magnitude of the destruction had stolen their words, leaving only the sound of labored breathing and the splashing of boots in oil-slicked puddles. Every man there knew the names of the crew. They weren't searching for strangers. They were searching for the men they had shared coffee with just hours before. The camaraderie of the Iron Brotherhood had turned into a desperate, silent prayer as they pried at the mangled doors of the locomotive. The light from their lanterns caught the drifting mist, creating a halo effect that made the entire scene feel like a dream or a nightmare frozen in time. The smell was unbearable, the metallic scent of blood mixed with the chemical stench of ruptured hydraulic lines and the sweet, sickly aroma of scorched pine. It was the smell of a machine that had become a coffin. As the first stretcher was carried up the steep, muddy slope, the rescuers formed a silent line, their heads bowed against the wind. The flickering light of their torches illuminated the strain on their faces, the grime, the sweat, and the suppressed grief. They were men of the 1980s, raised in a culture of stoicism, but the sight of the twisted remains of their friends broke through the hardest of shells. They worked with a frantic yet hopeless energy, knowing deep in their marrow that the mountain and the iron had left no room for survivors. The lanterns flickered low, their fuel running thin, mirroring the fading hope of the men who held them. This was the brutal reality of the Oregon line, a place where the price of a mistake or a betrayal was paid in the currency of human life. The rescue operation was not a victory, it was a cleanup, a grim accounting of the cost of one man's envy. The flickering lights in the dark were a testament to human resilience, but they were also a spotlight on the absolute fragility of the lives that served the rails. Each beam of light that cut through the fog only served to emphasize the vastness of the darkness that surrounded them, a darkness that had been summoned by a wrench and a heart full of spite. By the time the sun began to cast a pale, sickly glow over the peaks of the Cascades, the ravine was a graveyard of abandoned efforts. The lanterns were extinguished one by one, replaced by the cold, indifferent light of day. The rescuers stood at the edge of the pit, their clothes soaked through with rain and oil, looking down at the mangled carcass of the number 402. They had done what they could, but the iron had claimed its 14 souls, and the Oregon wilderness was already beginning to settle back into its ancient, unblinking silence. The tragedy was no longer an event. It was a permanent scar, documented by the flickering light of a long, terrible night. As the last of the bodies were recovered, a heavy, oppressive quiet returned to Milepost 114. The rescuers retreated, their work finished, leaving the twisted steel to the rain and the moss. The flickering lanterns were gone, but the memory of what they had revealed would haunt the Oregon line for a century. The Iron Brotherhood had been decimated, and as the men boarded the return train, they looked back at the ravine, knowing that the ghost of this night would never truly leave them. The tragedy was complete, and the light of the lanterns had only served to prove that in the war between man and the mountain always had the final word. The dawn that broke over the Oregon Cascades was not a herald of hope, but a cold, clinical revelation of a world that had lost its center. At the deserted station, miles from the carnage of Milepost 114, Elijah sat alone on a weathered wooden bench that had been bleached gray by decades of unyielding rain. He sat perfectly still, a statue of flesh and oilskin, as the first pale, sickly light of morning filtered through the thick canopy of firs. The air was frigid, tasting of wet iron and wood smoke, but Elijah didn't feel the chill. He was occupied by a far more profound coldness, the absolute, echoing vacuum that had replaced his resentment,
the moment the first report of the crash had crackled over the yard's radio. His hands, those gnarled instruments of his family's legacy, rested heavily on his knees. They were stained with the dark, indelible ink of the railway, the grease of the sabotage still trapped beneath his fingernails like a confession. He stared at them with a detached, clinical curiosity, as if they belonged to a stranger. He had expected to feel a surge of triumph, a visceral sense of justice restored, but there was only this, a heavy, leaden silence that sat in his chest like a stone. He had brought the temple down, but instead of standing amongst the ruins as a king, he found himself buried beneath them, a ghost in a world of his own making. The station was an island of stagnant time. A single naked bulb hummed above him, its yellow light dying in the face of the encroaching gray day. The rhythmic ticking of the station clock, click, clack, click, clack, sounded like the heartbeat of a dying machine. Every few minutes, a gust of wind would swirl the mist across the empty tracks, the steel rails stretching out into the distance like silver funeral ribbons. There were no more trains coming this way today. The line was severed, the pulse of the valley stopped by his own hand. Elijah had wanted to stop time, to preserve the era of his father, but he had only succeeded in creating a wasteland where time no longer mattered. He looked at the empty space where the highball signal usually glowed. It was dark, a hollow eye socket in the skull of the depot. In his mind, the screams of the metal at the ravine were still echoing, a discordant symphony that drowned out the morning birds. He thought of Thomas's smile, Pete's gravelly laugh, and the crumpled photo in Miller's pocket. They weren't abstractions anymore. They were a weight that was slowly crushing the air from his lungs. The promotion, the envy, the perceived slights of the corporation, they all felt like trivial, dusty relics now, insignificant compared to the absolute, irreversible finality of 14 lost lives. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes to a man who has achieved his darkest desire and found it hollow. Elijah was the only person in the world who knew the truth of what had happened at Milepost 114, and that secret was a poison that would ensure he was never truly alone again. The ghosts were already there, sitting beside him on the bench, their presence felt in the shifting of the fog and the creak of the station's timber frame. He was a man who had traded his humanity for a moment of power, and as the sun failed to warm his face, he realized the exchange was permanent. He reached into his pocket and felt the heavy, cold weight of the wrench, the weapon that had etched his name into the history of the line. He wanted to throw it into the river, to bury it in the mud, but he couldn't let go. It was the only thing left that connected him to anything real. He sat there as the world slowly woke up around him, as the first sirens began to wail in the distance, and as the first rays of light revealed the grime on his jacket. He didn't move. He didn't run. He simply waited, a hollow shell of a man on a cold bench, watching the mist dissolve to reveal a world he no longer recognized and a life that was already over. The Iron Ghost had finally found his throne, but it was made of shadow and ash. The Oregon dawn continued its slow, indifferent ascent, illuminating the tracks that led to nowhere. The tragedy was no longer a plan, it was a reality, and as the first drops of morning rain began to fall, Elijah closed his eyes, hoping for a darkness that would never come. He had silenced the number 402, but in doing so, he had ensured that he would never know a moment of silence again for the rest of his miserable, haunted life.
The courtroom in the county seat of Douglas was not a place of modern aesthetics. It was a chamber of heavy oak, high ceilings, and the suffocating smell of floor wax and old, dusty law books. It felt like a tomb designed for the living. The year 1985 had arrived, but inside these walls, the atmosphere remained trapped in a gray, timeless haze. Pale, hazy light filtered through the tall, narrow windows, illuminating millions of dust motes that danced in the stagnant air, like the ghosts of the 14 men who had perished at Milepost 114. There was no theatricality here, only the grim, methodical grinding of the legal machine, a machine that, much like the railway, moved with a cold and indifferent momentum. Elijah sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller than he ever had in the cab of a locomotive. He wore a heavy, ill-fitting brown suit that smelled of mothballs, a garment that looked like a costume on his weathered, grease-stained frame. He didn't look at the gallery, which was filled with the widows and orphans of the number 402, their faces pale and drawn,
their eyes fixed on him with a mixture of horror and exhausted hatred. He sat with his back straight, his gnarled hands clasped tightly in front of him, his icy blue eyes staring at a fixed point on the judge's bench. He was no longer a man. He was a relic being examined under a microscope, a specimen of a dying breed that had turned predatory. The evidence was presented with the same clinical precision that Elijah had used to sabotage the switch. The prosecution brought forth the heavy, industrial-grade wrench found in his home, still bearing the microscopic scars of its encounter with the rusted iron of Milepost 114. They showed the technical diagrams of the split switch, explaining to a jury of farmers and loggers how a simple turn of a bolt could transform a million-pound train into a mountain of wreckage. The experts spoke of shearing forces, kinetic energy, and intentional mechanical failure, their dry academic tones contrasting sharply with the visceral, bloody reality of the ravine. But the most damning evidence wasn't the metal, it was the silence. Throughout the weeks of testimony, Elijah never spoke. He never offered an excuse, never pleaded for mercy, and never expressed a flicker of remorse. He watched the proceedings with a detached, almost professional interest, as if he were auditing a routine maintenance report. When the widows wept, he didn't flinch. When the photos of the mangled wreckage were projected onto the screen, he didn't turn away. He remained the Iron Ghost, a man who had already retreated so far into the fortress of his own bitterness that the words of the law could no longer reach him. The judge was a man of the old school, his face a roadmap of stern lines, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that commanded the room. When he finally delivered the sentence, the silence in the courtroom was so absolute you could hear the rhythmic ticking of the radiator and the distant, lonely whistle of a freight train passing through the valley miles away. The sentence was life, a slow, agonizing decay in a concrete cell, far from the sound of the rails and the smell of the pine forest. But for Elijah, the real sentence had been passed long before he entered the room. He was already a prisoner of his own legacy, bound to the memory of the 14 men he had sent into the dark. As the bailiffs led him away, his boots, the only part of his old life he was allowed to keep, made a heavy, rhythmic thud, thud, thud on the wooden floor. It was a sound that echoed the heartbeat of the locomotive he had destroyed. He didn't look back at the grieving families. He didn't look at the cameras of the news crews. He looked straight ahead, into a future that offered nothing but the gray walls of a prison and the internal, never-ending replay of the scream of the steel at Milepost 114. The scales of justice had been balanced, but the weight of the iron would remain on his soul forever. The trial was a closing chapter for the Oregon line, a formal acknowledgement of a wound that would never truly heal. The corporation would rebuild the tracks, the news cycle would move on to the next tragedy, and the families would be left to navigate a world that had been irrevocably altered by one man's envy. As Elijah was driven away in the back of a dark transport van, he watched the Oregon forest pass by through the iron bars of the window. The pines were still there, indifferent and ancient, watching the ghost of a man being carried into a silence that even his hatred could no longer fill.
Time, much like the relentless Oregon rain, has a way of washing away the sharp edges of even the most jagged tragedies. Decades have bled into one another since the night the number 402 screamed its way into the abyss. Today, Milepost 114 is no longer a place of industry or progress. It has become a hollow sanctuary of the wild, a secret graveyard where the forest is slowly, methodically digesting the iron remains of Elijah's spite. The tracks that once hummed with the pulse of a nation's commerce now lie twisted and broken, silver veins that have turned a dull, flaking orange-red, disappearing beneath a thick, suffocating carpet of emerald moss and creeping vines. The ravine, once a theater of fire and twisted steel, is now a cathedral of silence. If you stand at the edge of the precipice today, you won't hear the roar of a diesel engine or the laughter of the Iron Brotherhood. You will only hear the ancient rhythmic sigh of the wind through the hemlocks and the distant, indifferent rush of the river below. Nature does not remember the promotion that wasn't given or the bitterness of a third-generation railroader. It only knows the slow, patient work of decomposition. The massive locomotive, once a million-pound titan of industry, is now a skeletal ruin, its rusted hull serving as a trellis for wildflowers,
and a shelter for the very creatures it once terrified with its thunder. There is a profound, elegiac peace here, but it is a peace built upon a foundation of ghosts. Local legends speak of a phantom whistle that echoes through the gorge on foggy October nights, a long, mournful sound that carries the weight of 14 lost souls. They say that if you look closely at the rusted remains of the switch, you can still see the ghost of a man in an oilskin coat, forever kneeling in the dark, trapped in the singular moment of his greatest sin. But these are just stories told by those who fear the dark. The reality is far more somber. Milepost 114 is simply a place where human frailty met the cold laws of physics, and the mountain won. The legacy of the Iron Ghost lives on not in the history books of the railway, but in the shivering leaves of the alders that grow through the shattered cab of the engine. It is a reminder that envy is a fire that eventually consumes its architect, leaving behind nothing but cold ash and the silence of the forgotten. The world moved on. The corporation built a new line, miles away from this haunted ground, abandoning Milepost 114 to the mist and the rot. The industry that Elijah so desperately wanted to be a part of simply bypassed his ruin, leaving him to be forgotten by the very people he sought to punish. As the pale afternoon sun filters through the canopy, casting long, dusty beams of light across the rust and iron, the tragedy feels distant, almost mythological. The blood has long since been washed into the soil, feeding the roots of the trees that now tower over the wreckage. The fatal memories of this place are now etched into the very stones of the ravine. It is a monument to the terrifying permanence of a single impulsive act of malice. The iron has returned to the earth, the lives have returned to the ether, and only the Oregon wilderness remains, unblinking and eternal. In the end, the railway was just a temporary scar on an ancient land. The forest has reclaimed its territory, weaving a shroud of green over the steel and the sorrow. The story of the number 402 is now a whisper in the wind, a warning to those who carry the heavy burden of resentment into the dark. The tracks end here, lost in the ferns and the fog, leading to a destination that was never on any map. The absolute, haunting silence of a life consumed by spite. The Iron Ghost is finally still, and the mountain is at rest. The mist rolls in again, as it always does, swallowing the ravine and the rusted remains of the dream. Milepost 114 disappears from view, returning to the shadows of the Cascades. The journey is over, the ledger is closed, and the only sound left is the soft, persistent patter of the rain, washing the memory of the iron into the dark, indifferent earth of Oregon.